For those of us who have teenage children or have taken teenagers through the parenting process, ours, one of the scariest parts of teenagers is, apart from the assertion of independence that always comes as an interesting challenge to parental authority, particularly after they were such nice children, and then what happened to the teenagers, is that you actually have to confront puberty. And the puberty of teenagers in particular, as they metamorphose from childhood into adulthood and assume the sexual characteristics of usually their gender. And it's a bit of a minefield for parents, and as to how you approach it. And certainly as somebody who's got 3 teenagers currently, you do go, okay, what am I going to say? Without appearing a complete hypocrite, of course, but at the same time, some sort of useful advice. So a lot of teachers, a lot of parents over the last 20, 30, 40 years in this country have pretty much abandoned that quest and decided, no, it's just too tough, too messy, I don't want to have an argument. And believe it or not, I think I'll leave it to the schools to do. And so that was one of the primary reasons why in the 1980s sex education was introduced into New Zealand secondary schools, because it was felt that parents were doing not just a bad job, but they were doing no job at all. And there was the perceived need for sex education, sexuality education to come into our schools. Prior to that, it had been some sort of, I don't know, I'm trying to remember my own, but I think it was some sort of movie that was shown on a night with cartoons, and that was pretty much it. And so and that's because parents have always felt, maybe it was quite Victorian in this concept, we're not happy or comfortable discussing anything to do with sexuality with our children, and so schools have predominantly played that role. Well, there's been obviously some criticism and pushback in recent years as to what is being taught. And it's sort of like, and how, at what age you should teach those children. But as I talk to you now in health curriculums throughout New Zealand, which I think are compulsory to 5th form level, no, I think about it, my year 12 girl is still getting these, I don't know how, as part of her, not at NCA level 2, but as part of her school. She goes to a state secondary school, state co-ed secondary school. There has been a great deal of question more about not what happens to your body, but how you have relationships with other people. And this is where my next guest comes in. Genna Hawkins-Boulton is a 25-year-old Auckland woman who, along with her friends, set up a Teach Us Consent campaign. It actually, I think, emanated in Australia, but it has come to New Zealand, and she's very much its front page, if you like, its spokesperson here. The idea that in our schools we should be teaching the concept of consent, because people are having sex, even though parents go, they are having sex, and the concept of consent seems to be something that has gone into the milieu and is being inadequately portrayed to teenagers, male and female. Joining us to talk about that is Genna now. Genna Hawkins-Boulton. Welcome to the show, Genna.
Morena, how are you?
I'm well. I've got that right, haven't I? You're concerned that we might be knowing, oh gosh, that goes there, and this is what happens there, and you get all these periods and stuff like that. But when you actually have sex, that's where the problem starts. Is that your thesis?
Yes, so what we are campaigning for at Let's Talk Consent is basically making it compulsory for consent to be included in the curriculum around sex education in health class. But also we are really campaigning for it to be a wide school approach, because we know from speaking with teachers and just what teachers have been quite open about in general is that there are different barriers to teaching, comprehensive sex education, including consent. So it's really important for there to be a wide school approach the New Zealand Health Association has also really campaigned for that, because there are time restrictions to, this amount of time health teachers have with their students, and so it really needs to be supported by different faculties in order to reaffirm the importance of consent in various areas of our lives.
Now, the Education Review Office in this country has recommended that about 12 to 15 hours a year, so it's not a lot of time, but 12 to 15 hours a year should be spent on relationships and sexuality education. But a recent Teacher's Perspective report said that most schools were providing less than that. I said to you in the introduction, I've got a Year 12 girl. I don't know what sexuality education most Year 10 boy gets. I'm not sure. I haven't asked. Isn't that dreadful? But it certainly wouldn't be 12 to 15 hours a year. I think she had a recent talk. Somebody came in, talked to them for a couple of hours, and that was pretty much it.
Yeah, and it's just not enough. It's also, we really are pushing for it to be as comprehensive and age appropriate as possible. And it's also coming from a point where we are campaigning for it to be included earlier in the curriculum, and not even in the context of sexual intimacy when we are talking about consent. It's about introducing the concept of consent in the much earlier stages of childhood, promoting teachings around positive communication, trust and learning, and also just learning to be able to respect another person's autonomy over their body as well, and to be able to have those conversations around setting their own boundaries. If they're young and they're I guess in the early stages of childhood, and someone gives them a hug and they don't really want a hug, they can be like, I'm not okay with that. So introducing those concepts really early on, and so that when you do get to the stage in high school when you are learning about sex education and you are learning about consent in the context of sexual intimacy, those concepts around boundary setting and positive, healthy communication and relationships isn't a new shocking concept. They can basically apply all that learning to this new context.
Listen, you've been through adolescence much more recently than I have. It's a messy, complicated, complex time. Horrible emotions and good emotions flow through you, it seems, in equal proportion. But the difference, I guess, between my generation and yours, Genna, and my daughter's generation in particular now, is pornography. Which is easily accessible. Is hard pornography. We would never have had it in our time. I think we had the occasional Man magazine or Playboy. And is showing a physical relationship between people that is, got to be fairly physical. Is that complicating things in terms of consent for adolescents?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's if you look at the statistics of the sexual harm victims, that's very much concentrated between 16 to 24-year-olds, so they're 4 times more likely to be harmed in that way. So absolutely, pornography does bring in a very complicated issue where consent isn't really shown at all, and it does ultimately normalise situations of sexual harm. And so when young people are exposed to that content, they are to basically believe that that's normal, that that engagement with sexual intimacy without consent is normal, and it should be that's what they should seek themselves. And so that does complicate it a lot, and so that's why introducing a really comprehensive age appropriate consent education earlier on is so important, so that when they do inevitably encounter these harmful narratives of with that shown in pornography, they're able to at least apply a critical eye to it and question, is this actually what I want? But it does absolutely complicate things. It is a really sticky topic. It's also really hard for teachers to go up against the narratives that are on social media too, and so it's all about just trying to create a culture of consent to try to mitigate the fact that sexual harm in lots of cases for young people is really normalised to the point where you really can't actually navigate it or understand if you have experienced it. It's what makes it even more complicated.
Now, talking about this, we're mostly talking about from a female perspective, but as the father of a 14-year-old boy, I don't want my boy getting into trouble legally in the future through not understanding where the barriers are, and I guess that would be another fear that many parents would have as well. I have those conversations with my children, and I guess I trust them, as you do, to be able to make the right and wrong decision, not to impose, not to force, not to give people unwanted attention, unnecessarily, etc. And it's such a fine line sometimes between, I guess, telling somebody I'm interested in them and pestering them. And you're suggesting you need some sort of lesson to know where that line is.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's also, even as another complicated layer to it at the moment, is that our consent laws don't really actually reflect what we're teaching. And so there is a whole campaign at the moment that's trying to reform our consent laws to introduce affirmative consent. Because at the moment, our consent laws don't define what consent is, it defines what consent isn't, it defines the situations where consent can't be given. And so I guess having that conversation, having that clear line, what's consensual, what isn't, can really be affirmed in our laws. And at the moment, it's not. And so that's why there is like a really strong campaign going in at the moment. It's going through Parliament, I think, the petition to reform our consent law. So making those conversations is so much easier when you have that legal backing as well.
Listen, I grew up in a generation in which I have to say I think that the line between consent and rape was, to be perfectly honest with you, not clear, certainly in comparison to the way things are now. Who are you finding most resistance to from on terms of consent education? Because to be perfectly honest with you, as a conservative, and I'm a conservative and I'm a conservative parent, I like the idea of consent education because it protects my sons and my daughters, or has the potential to in the future. So I can't understand what the objection would be from a conservative point of view. Where are you finding your opposition from?
Well, to be honest, I feel like I have been quite supported thus far. I think the only backlash comes from the idea of abstinence, promoting abstinence.
Well, that's fair enough.
Yeah, that's probably the main backlash. But again, in that idea of abstinence, it's also really important to promote consent, because consent doesn't completely disappear in marriage. So that's what I would like to, I guess, respond to that backlash. But I haven't had any major backlash yet, so we're interested to see what other opinions come forward.
But the other thing that's interesting, I'm reading. Now, remember, I'm reading, so I'm not involved in a relationship with a 25-year-old girl, so I don't know. But I'm reading at the moment, and I have these conversations with my children, or my teenage children, and the difference between my generation, baby boomers, who, to be perfectly with you, thought they invented sex and wanted to prove it, and your generation is interesting. There are numerous articles, scientific reports, behavioural journals that are reporting at the moment that your generation in particular is much more, what's the word? Much less gung-ho about these matters, much more cautious. Is that your perspective?
I think so. Well, I mean, from the community that I have, I think that's also, we are a lot more cautious. I think that's also because we're more likely to encounter people who, don't have the education. And so I think in terms of feeling cautious around sex, I think that's definitely true in this generation. And also we're up against this whole multi-billion-dollar industry of pornography. And so, of course, we're going to come to these situations very cautious, and that's why it's really important to have the education so that when we are coming into these situations, we do have that understanding of being able to say no, the different ways someone can say no, setting boundaries, and also from the other end, just recognising when someone's clearly uncomfortable and the other person's setting their boundaries and how to respect that.
Okay, now I understand your aim and objective. As a conservative parent, I would actually suggest that it's not a bad thing at all. But at stage, do you introduce consent? See, there's an argument also from conservative parents like me that sexuality education starts too early, before children have necessarily even conceptualised it, and so introducing the topic is uncomfortable to them. You'd bring consent education in, as soon as you start teaching sexuality, full stop?
Yeah, but again, like I think in the context of sexual consent, yeah, I think that's really important because it's really important to introduce these concepts before, I guess, the risk, that they do start engaging in that behaviour. It's really important to basically introduce that before they are engaging in it, so that when they do get to the stage when they are getting intimate with, their peers, it's really important that they do understand how to recognise someone's boundaries, how to respect that, how to respect someone when they say no to them, and also we have such a culture of entitlement when it comes to sexual intimacy, where we see that a lot on our statistics of sexual harm. And so it's really important to get to the root of that issue. I mean, I know that consent can't solve the whole issue of sexual harm. It is an absolute core piece of the puzzle. But yeah, I think it's absolutely important to introduce that as early as possible.
All right. Genna, thank you very much for joining us, and all power to you. Where do you go next?
Well, we are currently building up our startup social enterprise called Let's Talk Consent. It's all about promoting consent culture in businesses and schools and within young people to really create like a symbiotic relationship where each, I guess, sector of society can contribute to building a really strong culture around respect and consent. So that's where the next steps are. We're just going to be building that, and yeah, hopefully releasing a national report as well to do with consent education. So yeah, that's our next steps.
Good on you. All right, nice to join you. Thank you very much for your time. Thank you. That is Genna Hawkins-Boulton, who is the co-founder of Let's Talk Consent. It's interesting, isn't it? This is where the Conservatives and the Liberals actually have common cause. Genna's campaign would actually draw more support from Conservative family-based organisations than you might think. Primarily because Conservative family-based organisations are saying it's a good idea to think about it rather than. And pornography has certainly changed the way in which people view sex. Well, not my generation, but certainly younger people. And that is a suggestion, and good on her.